We'll do it again with 5, 4.
Hello, and welcome to AIDS 2018 Live. We're so excited for you to join us. We're here, this is your all-access pass to the International AIDS Conference here in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And we're so excited for you to join us in this vital conversation that we've been having already through the last couple days and we'll continue to have all week, which is about the global gag rule, which is newly impacting the HIV space, unlike it's ever had done before. And it's, I think, very vital that we have these conversations to make sure this community and the whole health and human rights community comes together to understand the threat that this policy imposes and the strategies we can take to mitigate it. So I'm so excited to be joined by my colleagues. Let me first introduce myself. My name is Chloe Cooney. I'm the Senior Director of Global Advocacy at Planned Parenthood Global and Planned Parenthood Federation of America. And I'm joined by, I'm going to let you introduce yourselves this time.
Sure. My name is Latanya Mapfret, and I'm the Executive Director of Planned Parenthood Global, based in Nairobi, Kenya, and also a VP at PPFA.
My name is Joy Asasira. I work with the Center for Health, Human Rights and Development in Uganda, and that's in Kampala. And we do research and advocacy, and we champion the justiciability of the right to health in Uganda and East Africa.
Thank you for joining us. And unfortunately, you both know well the impact of the global gag rule and have insights to share with this community. So thank you for sharing your insights. I am going to start with Joy, but who don't know. The global gag rule is a policy that, appropriately enough, came of origin in 1984. And it's been in and out of place for the last 30 plus years. But in this 18 months ago, Trump reinstated it and expanded it on his first day in office. And the global gag rule is a conditionality put on global health assistance that says that as a condition of working with the U.S., you have to, you're prohibited from providing any services, information, referrals, education, or even advocating for safe and legal abortion in your own country and with your own funding. And so this policy has long had harms that we've seen in the family planning funding directly. So it's always impacted the HIV space, and Latanya, I know you have experience from that in the past, but it's most directly impacting it now. So it's very important that this community understand it, anticipate its impacts, and work to respond. So Joy, I'm going to start with you, who I know you are directly impacted by this policy. But you're also, as an advocate for health and human rights in Uganda, looking at the landscape. And I'm wondering, can you speak to what the impact you are seeing in Uganda right now?
Yes, thank you, Chloe, and thank you for joining us, those of you who are tuning in on Facebook Live. So basically, I'll first start by pointing out that Uganda is one of the largest recipients of global health financing from the U.S., and that means that we are highly dependent. And in 2016, about 70% of the health financing was from the U.S. And so when the global gag rule was reinstated, very many players across the board, including the organizations, but also the users of the services were affected. And what we saw when the global gag rule was reinstated was that, first of all, an initial reaction was like, people were so confused, because initially they thought that it was it carried with it legal implications, that if you did not certify, that you'd either be doing something illegal or that you were obligated to certify. So the immediate reaction was people running around in a frenzy, trying to understand, what is the global gag rule, what do I need to do to comply, and how am I going to manage if I lose funding? So immediately there was a lot of frenzy because of the reliance on the assistance from USAID, and then the financial assistance. And then the second impact that we've seen is that the actual loss of services. That goes without saying, because some organizations that directly provide services, especially for women and girls living in hard-to-reach areas, or who are very, very poor, living in poverty, they've lost the ability to provide these services and to sustainably provide these services. So it means that in the near future, whereas the impact may not be felt right now because they probably had a little funding for a few more months after the reinstatement, in the future, there will be women who are not assured of availability and access to contraceptive services that are very critical. And we know that this includes also for HIV positive women, because many times, because of either their health status at a particular time, they're not in the position to get pregnant. They cannot afford to get pregnant because of their health conditions. So definitely we are seeing a very huge impact of the global gag rule.
Thank you for sharing that. It's not great to hear, but I appreciate you sharing that perspective. And LaTanya, from your perch, where you're working across 12 countries, and then I know engaged with so many around the world, what are you seeing globally as the impact? And how are you seeing organizations foregoing funding?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the largest thing for me is that this is the first time that I've lived in the sexual and reproductive health space directly. Coming from organizations that are much more multilateral or bilateral, where we work across sectors, it has been very heartbreaking, to be honest, to watch how this plays out. So we know the day after it was signed, MSI and IPPF, which are two large partner organizations of ours, had declared that they would have to say no to the global gag rule, rightly so. But then you can almost just see step by step, month by month, clinics closing, women actually, again, which I feel sometimes like purposely confused about whether or not they can even go to an IPPF clinic, because would it be open? Would MSI be open? So you hear global gag rule, you kind of translate that into no more services for safe abortion, which then translates into where do I get my contraception, where do I get my cancer screening, and so where do I get my HIV test? So all of this then for the average woman just means that we're not going to be able to do that anymore. And so the confusion that's led by the organizations who are not sure what to do, which is what you spoke to, is also then translated into real women and girls and families who get those services and rely on those services, just not understanding what to do on a day-to-day basis and trying to think of ways that they can go by that. And God forbid something happens and they have to make some choices and they just don't know where to reach. And a big thing about the global gag rule is the lack of information that's out there. It is, again, we've lived with this over time. We know what happens in the sexual and reproductive health space, but we just don't understand now that it's been broadened, how exactly is it going to fall out? And nothing is looking good right now. So we know the sort of classic organizations that lose funding. What we don't understand now are some of the ones that are directly going to be hit from HIV, AIDS, malaria. I mean, we can go down the list of, potential hits that we can get from this policy, and that is the biggest concern for me. So it's not just the ones that we knew would lose money and who maybe can make that up in other ways, but it is the ones that don't even really quite understand what this has to do with them, who might be affected.
Thank you for that. And for those of you just joining, we're here live from AIDS 2018. This is your all access pass to the International AIDS Conference here in Amsterdam, and we're having a conversation about the global gag rule and its impact on the fight against HIV. And as we're hearing, the impact's not good. So I want to continue with you, LaTanya, and I think the point of stigma that you spoke about is such a vital issue for the HIV community, because we know stigma is already such a challenge in our collective efforts to see an AIDS-free generation, and anything that's pushing our conversations about our health and our human rights out of the sunlight and is going to harm our collective efforts. So LaTanya, I mean, what are there alternatives for organizations? And I know, Planned Parenthood Global, we don't accept U.S. funding already, so we're working with and able to be partner with organizations. Can you speak to Planned Parenthood Global strategy as well to respond to this moment?
Sure. I mean, I'll just say in our last session, a Malawian woman asked me, are we going to be able to do anything about this? And it is the quintessential question, because I think when people hear it, it's like a fait accompli, there is nothing else we can do. This is absolutely going to mean that we can't do and provide services that we need. And I know that we, from the Planned Parenthood side, certainly don't want that impression. There are things that we can do. Even if you don't get the executive order off the book, first thing is information, right? So we have to make sure that organizations, national organizations, local organizations, and that community members themselves understand what it means so that it's clear. So if a USAID office in a particular country say you can't do X, that they're able to say, no, actually we can, because we're doing it with our government, and the government is not susceptible to the global gag rule. So we need to make sure people are educated, and I know that Planned Parenthood is doing that with our work and with the coalition in Washington, D.C. So that's going to be hugely important. The second thing is the data and the evidence. It's going to be incredibly important because even when we had what I'll call a friend in the administration, it was very difficult to really point to how the global gag rule has impacted women on the ground. And so now we have this horrible chance, quite frankly, to be able to look at that directly and be able to point to specific cases. I know we're working with Columbia University on a more sort of longitudinal academic study that's looking at this and counting it all up. But there are other studies out there that we can look for to be able to provide us for the information and data we need for advocacy, both from Washington, D.C., but also in the countries where this impact is happening, to be able to hold their own governments accountable for providing these services, because these policies in Uganda should not be dependent on a grant from the U.S. government. These should be commitments to the citizens of that country. So that's what we have to do.
Well, and that's a perfect pivot to Joy. I do want to just take an opportunity for those tuning in to call out that there is a petition circulating at this conference to really lift up voices opposing this policy, that calling on not just the U.S. government, but donors all around the world and other governments to stand up and do everything to mitigate the harm. And you can find that at Planned Parenthood Global's Twitter page. It's circulating in individuals and organizations. So we encourage you to add your name and your voice so that at the end of this week we can really show this collective community standing together. So Joy, with that, I know Sayhurt is directly impacted by the global gag rule. Can you talk about your experience as an organization and then sort of how you're looking to mitigate its harm in the way that LaTanya is describing?
Yes, thank you, Chloe. As an organization, we have had to lose 2 grants because definitely as a health and human rights, an organization that's working to advance health and human rights, we believe in a holistic approach. And especially when we're working on maternal health, which is a huge problem, public health crisis that we have in Uganda. We cannot pick and choose what aspects of the contributors of preventable maternal mortality we work on. So as an organization, we're working holistically on all the preventable causes, including unsafe abortion. So we cannot and could not and will not certify and say that we will be, gagged. We want self-censure because this is what we're required to do. And so because of this, we've had to lose 2 major grants that were enabling us educate women about preventable maternal mortality, but also educate key stakeholders like the policymakers and the health workers. And so we have had to think about what it is that as an organization we can do to make up for that lost funding. And luckily there are a number of partners like yourselves who are willing to help us work through that and see how to address that gap. But then the other thing that we're doing is because, as I had earlier indicated, many organizations had never thought about the concept of the global gag rule. They hadn't interacted with it. So the first step of what we are doing to mitigate the impact of the global gag rule is to educate these different organizations to document what it is and sort of put it in an easy to understand way on paper or online, and then also to explain very expressly to organizations that they are not bound to certify. Because I think earlier one of the key things that had come out, or one of the perceptions that was held was that they had to certify, and we're making it clear that they do have a choice. They are autonomous institutions that have a right to certify or not certify, and whatever they choose is fine. But then just also speak about what LaTanya talked about in terms of what we are doing to sort of mitigate moving forward is to also understand the impact, to start documenting at an institutional level. I think we're working with partners to document in terms of the national impact, But also what needs to happen is at an institutional level, we need to understand how we are going to be affected by the global gag rule. And so we're putting in place a strategy to do that. And then we can share this with different organizations and show them, sort of what the trends are, what they should expect, and why they need to prepare, because this is a recurrent thing. But in terms of our government, and I have to really speak about this, is that the one thing that we've realized is this also presents us an opportunity, as Latanya said, to hold our government accountable in terms of providing health care, accessible, good quality health care for all Ugandans, especially women and girls, knowing that, we have so many, we're still challenged by a high number of infections among especially women. But our girls, we see that about 500 girls get infected with HIV, young women and girls, every week. So we are using this opportunity to say, yes, this is a global policy. It's a U.S. administration, it's a U.S. government policy, but Uganda is an autonomous state. And as a government, you have an obligation to provide services regardless of what's going on, elsewhere. And you cannot use this as an excuse to say, we're not providing adequate services because Trump reinstated the global gag rule. So we are definitely using this as a huge advocacy moment to hold our government accountable as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. So a quick follow-up, and we'll make these our last questions, and if you can also conclude with any sort of top-line actions you recommend for this audience. Joy, I know that we've all read in the news that the sex ed debate in Uganda has been very active. Can you speak to, has the global gag rule had an impact on that conversation at all?
Certainly. So just to quickly say that sexuality education in Uganda was banned in about 2016, and basically it was banned everywhere, both in formal and informal, settings. So even in the home, you were not allowed to talk about to educate your child.
As a parent, I have to laugh at that.
Yes, you are not allowed to educate your child about sex. So over the last 1 year or so, the Ministry of Education came up with a policy that was aimed at, sort of bridging this gap and providing the framework that was missing. But what we find is that this framework is best, so the three guiding principles on which this framework is based are religion, culture, and national ethics. I don't know what that is. I honestly cannot tell you that I can point to the specific. But the interesting thing is that we find that the global gag rule and the very, fundamentalist approach and the very, the approach to sort of pushing against or pushing out any values that are related to, sexual reproductive health, access to services and access to information and evidence-based comprehensive services. I think that approach, or the spirit that is, embodied, within which the global gag rule is embodied, has emboldened opposition in Uganda. And I think they feel like we are validated to say that people shouldn't talk about sex, that sexuality is not something that is part of our culture or is not, does not align with our values. And I think this whole global trend is definitely emboldening, this very restrictive, very, conservative, moralist approach to services and policies in Uganda.
So, Latanya, with that, what's your top line message to the conference, and what should we all be doing?
It's just making me think, Joy, fight back. I don't know, maybe a different question would elicit the same answer, but I do feel like we cannot have a policy that does not represent us in the United States as Americans, and we cannot have a policy that affects what's happening in another country altogether in a negative way and not use our voices to change it. So I know certainly for Planned Parenthood and for many of the organizations in our coalitions, both American and otherwise, who are doing this work every day and have seen progress over the last 2 decades, is stand up, fight back, and use your voice. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you, for this conversation. And just to echo some of the key points, I think, the global gag rule compounds stigma, and stigma is our enemy here. So we need to raise our voices on all levels to fight back at every level that we're working. There's no work that is too small to fight back on when it comes to this policy and policies like it that are aiming to repress our health and our rights. And again, I do want to make one other pitch for the statement that we have going this week. You can find it on Planned Parenthood Global's Twitter page and many others as well. But it is important that we all take this moment in this conference to say that we oppose this policy and that all of us have a role to play in fighting its harm. So thank you for joining us for this important important conversation. We're really eager for the conversations to continue all week long on this topic and so many more. But I certainly so far am at this point feeling extremely optimistic and mobilized by the conversations and support and